This module focuses on an assessment called running records, which I think you were introduced to in Block 1. In order to collect a running record from a student and interpret the results, you need to understand the three queuing systems. Before we get into the queuing systems, though, I want to point something out about reading, something that will hopefully make the idea of queuing systems more relevant. What you see on your screen is a text and an indication of where the reader who was reading that text moved and focused his eyes. Don't worry about the circles that have numbers in them. Just look at the line with the open circles. The open circles indicate where the reader fixed his eyes momentarily. The line indicates where the reader moved his eyes. So you can see that the first place the reader fixed his eyes was right between the E and the R of the word there. Then on the S of was. The reader never fixes his eyes on the word an in the first line, but moves to the D in the word old, and from there to the letter F in the word from, and so on. What you should notice here is that the reader doesn't focus his eyes on every word. His eyes just move over some of the words, and his eyes don't even look directly at the words he and at the beginning of the third and fourth lines. The point here is that reading is not about focusing our eyes on words, decoding them, and then moving on to the next words, where we repeat the process. If we read that way, our reading would be really labored. We're actually able to produce words in a text by relying on cues that allow us to make predictions about what is coming next so that we don't have to belabor our reading efforts. Here's some more proof that we don't focus on every letter. Pause the video and read this out loud to yourself. I've never known anyone who has had any problem doing so. So if we don't focus or even look at every word, how do we know what words are coming up? We use cues, which are types of language signals. As native English speakers, we know a lot about our language and can and do rely heavily on that knowledge while we read. So let's look at the first sentence in the text that we looked at earlier when I was talking about reading and eye movements. This reader doesn't even focus on the word lady. So how does he know that the word is lady if he doesn't really stop and focus on it? He does so by relying on three different kinds of linguistic signals or cues. The first are grammar cues. We rely on what we know as native English speakers about parts of speech and word order in our language. Our brains know what part of speech is likely to come next. The second kind of cues are meaning cues. If we're monitoring our understanding of what we're reading, we can use the meaning that we're getting from the text to anticipate what will be coming next. Finally, we rely on letter sound cues. As you learned from reading the slide where the letters and the words were all jumbled, we don't need all of the letters, we just need one or two. In order to use the language of running records, we can't use the words grammar, meaning, letter sounds. There are fancier words for each of the queuing systems. We refer to grammar as syntax, meaning as semantics, and letter sound correspondences as the graphophonic queuing system. So let's look at each of the queuing systems separately, using the first line from the eye movement text. What does it mean to rely on syntax here? It means knowing what part of speech would come after the words, there was an old. Old is an adjective. Adjectives are either followed by other adjectives or by nouns. So if we're relying on this queuing system, our subconscious has narrowed down the options for what comes next considerably by telling us that it needs to be something that sounds like an adjective or a noun. So relying on the syntactic queuing system only, a reader might read, there was an old habit, there was an old city, or there was an old corner. These are all examples of putting a noun after this adjective. But sometimes we do put two adjectives together in the English language. So saying there was an old, tall, or an old fat, or an old quiet would work until the reader realized that what follows this word is not a noun. Therefore, the only 3 words in this list of 6 that would make a syntactically correct sentence to make the entire thing syntactically correct are the nouns. There was an old habit from Bath, there was an old city from Bath, and there was an old corner from Bath. These are all syntactically correct sentences. Using the semantic cueing system relies on understanding what is happening in the text, or at least on meaning at the sentence level. So while the words habit, city, and corner are syntactically correct, they create some sentences that don't really make sense. For example, saying there was an old city from Bath doesn't really make sense because Bath is a city. So someone who is relying on semantics but had no graphophonic cues to go by might put one of these words there, all of which result in semantically acceptable sentences. There was an old frog from Bath, there was an old book from Bath, there was an old man from Bath, or there was an old car from Bath. Notice that in order for a sentence to be semantically acceptable, it also has to be syntactically acceptable. All 4 of these words are nouns. But the reverse is not true. A sentence can be syntactically correct, but not semantically correct, as with the example, there was an old city from Bath. And then also with examples where people use nonsense words in place of real words, but the nonsense word sounds like the part of speech that's missing. For the last cueing system, we need at least some of the letters. Unlike semantics and syntax, we can't rely on the graphophonics cueing system without some of the letters themselves. Remember that proficient readers don't focus on every word and every letter. Also, we don't tend to rely on all of the letters to come up with the word. That's because we have both syntax and semantics to help us. So someone who is just relying on the first and last letters here, but who is not relying on both syntax and semantics, might choose one of these. There was an old lazy, there was an old levy, there was an old leafy, there was an old lakey. Proficient readers, though, rely on all 3 cueing systems. All 3 help us identify that what's missing here is the word lady. The purpose of doing a running record is to learn whether you're working with a reader who over or under relies on certain cueing systems.